Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western Literary Canon out loud. Well, we are still in Book 3 of The Will to Power, and we are in Section B. It's a small b, not a large b, so it's a subsection of a larger section. This one, for anybody interested in exactly the area, it is Aphorism 659. And this is subtitled Man. With that said, I'll get started. With the body as clue. Granting that the quote-unquote soul was only an attractive and mysterious thought from which philosophers rightly, but reluctantly separated themselves, that which they have since learned to put in its place is perhaps even more attractive and even more mysterious. The human body, in which the whole of the most distant and most recent past of all organic life once more becomes living and corporeal, seems to flow through this past and right over it like a huge and inaudible torrent. The body is a more wonderful thought than the old quote-unquote soul. In all ages, the body as our actual property, as our most certain being, in short, as our ego, has been more earnestly believed in than the spirit, or the soul, or the subject, as the school jargon now calls it. It has never occurred to anyone to regard his stomach as a strange or a divine stomach, but that there is a tendency and a predilection in man to regard all his thoughts as inspired, all his values as imparted to him by a god, all his instincts as dawning activities. This is proved by the evidence of every age in man's history. Even now, especially among artists, there may very often be noticed a sort of wonder and a deferential hesitation to decide, when the question occurs to them, by what means they achieved their happiest work, and from which world the creative thought came down to them. When they question in this way, they are possessed by a feeling of guilelessness and childish shyness. They dare not say, quote, "That came from me. It was my hand which threw that die." End quote. Conversely, even those philosophers and theologians who in their logic and piety found the most imperative reasons for regarding their body as a deception, and even as a deception overcome and disposed of, could not help recognizing the foolish fact that the body still remained. And the most unexpected proofs of this are to be found partly in Pauline and partly in Vedantic philosophy. But what does strength of faith ultimately mean? Nothing. A strong faith might be also a foolish faith. There is food for reflection. And supposing the faith in the body were ultimately but the result of a conclusion, supposing it were a false conclusion, as idealists declare it is, would it not then involve some doubt concerning the trustworthiness of the spirit itself, which thus causes us to draw wrong conclusions? Supposing the plurality of things in space and time and motion, and whatever the other first principles of a belief in the body may be, were errors, what suspicions would not then be roused against the spirit which led us to form such first principles? Let it suffice that the belief in the body is, at any rate for the present, a much stronger belief than the belief in the spirit, and he who would fain undermine it assails the authority of the spirit most thoroughly in so doing. 660. The body as empire. The aristocracy in the body, the majority of the rulers, the fight between the cells and the tissues. Slavery and the division of labor, the higher type alone possible through the subjection of the lower to a function. Pleasure and pain, not contraries, the feeling of power. Quote-unquote nutrition, only a result of the insatiable lust of appropriation in the will to power. Quote-unquote procreation. This is the decay which supervenes when the ruling cells are too weak to organize appropriated material. It is the molding force which will have a continual supply of new material, more force, the masterly construction of an organism out of an egg. The mechanical interpretation recognizes only quantities, but the real energy is in the quality. Mechanics can therefore only describe processes, it cannot explain them. Purpose. We should start out from the sagacity of plants. The concept of meliorism, not only greater complexity, but greater power. It need not be only greater masses. Conclusion concerning the evolution of man. The road to perfection lies in the bringing forth of the most powerful individuals, for whose use the great masses would be converted into mere tools, that is to say, into the most intelligent and flexible tools possible. 661. Why is all activity, even that of a sense, associated with pleasure? Because, before the activity was possible, an obstacle or a burden was done away with. Or rather, because all action is a process of overcoming, of becoming master of, and of increasing the feeling of power. The pleasure of thought. Ultimately, it is not only the feeling of power, but also the pleasure of creating and of contemplating the creation, for all activity enters our consciousness in the form of works. 662. Creating is an act of selecting and of finishing the thing selected. In every act of the will, this is the essential element. 663. All phenomena which are the result of intentions may be reduced to the intention of increasing power. 664. When we do anything, we are conscious of a feeling of strength. We often have this sensation before the act. That is to say, while imagining the thing to do, as for instance at the sight of an enemy, of an obstacle which we feel equal to. It is always an accompanying sensation. Instinctively, we think that this feeling of strength is the cause of the action, that it is the motive force. Our belief in causation is the belief in force and its effect. It is a transcript of our experience, in which we identify force and the feeling of force. Force, however, never moves things. The strength which is conscious, quote, does not set the muscles moving, end quote. Quote, of such a process we have no experience, no idea, end quote. Quote, we experience as little concerning force as a motive power, as concerning the necessity of a movement, end quote. Force is said to be the constraining element. Quote, all we know is that one thing follows another. We know nothing of either compulsion or arbitrariness in regard to the one following the other. Causality is first invented by thinking compulsion into the sequence of processes. A certain quote-unquote understanding of the thing is the result. That is to say, we humanize the process a little, we make it more familiar. The familiar is the known habitual fact of human compulsion associated with the feeling of force. 665. I have the intention of extending my arm, taking it for granted that I know as little of the physiology of the human body and of the mechanical laws of its movements as the man in the street. What could there be more vague, more bloodless, more uncertain than this intention compared with what follows it? And supposing I were the astutest of mechanics, and especially conversant with the formulae, which are applicable in this case, I should not be able to extend my arm one whit the better. Our quote-unquote knowledge and quote-unquote action in this case lies coldly apart, as though in two different regions. Again, Napoleon carries out a plan of campaign. What does that mean? In this case, everything concerning the consummation of the campaign is known, because everything must be done through words of command. But even here, subordinates are taken for granted who apply and adapt the general plan to the particular emergency, to the degree of strength, etc. 666. For ages, we have always ascribed the value of an action, of a character, of an existence, to the intention, to the purpose for which it was done, acted, or lived. This primeval idiosyncrasy of taste ultimately takes a dangerous turn, provided the lack of intention and purpose in all phenomena comes ever more to the front in consciousness. With it, a general depreciation of value seems to be preparing. Quote, all is without sense. End quote. This melancholy phrase means all sense lies in the intention, and if the intention is absolutely lacking, then sense must be lacking too. In conformity with this valuation, people were forced to place the value of life in a life after death, or in the progressive development of ideas, or of mankind, or of the people, or of man to Superman. But in this way the progressus in infinitum of purpose had been reached. It was ultimately necessary to find oneself a place in the process of the world. Perhaps with a dysdiamonistic outlook, it was a process which led to nonentity. In regard to this point, purpose needs a somewhat more severe criticism. It ought to be recognized that an action is never caused by a purpose, that an object and the means thereto are interpretations, by means of which certain points in a phenomena are selected and accentuated at the cost of other, more numerous points, that every time something is done for a purpose, something fundamentally different and yet other things happen. That in regard to this action done with a purpose, the case is the same as with the so-called purposefulness of the heat which is radiated from the sun. The greater part of the total sum is squandered. A portion of it, which is scarcely worth reckoning, has a purpose, has sense. That an end with its means is an absurdly indefinite description, which indeed may be able to command as a precept, as will, but presupposes a system of obedient and trained instruments, which in the place of the indefinite puts forward a host of determined entities, i.e., we imagine a system of clever but narrow intellects who postulate end and means, in order to be able to grant our only known end, the role of the cause of an action, a proceeding to which we have no right. It is tantamount to solving a problem by placing its solution in an inaccessible world which we cannot observe. Finally, why could we not end by merely an accompanying feature in the series of changes among the active forces which bring about the action, a pale stenographic symbol stretched in the consciousness beforehand, and which serves as a guide to what happens, even as a symbol of what happens not as its cause? But in this way we criticize will itself. Is it not an illusion to regard that which enters consciousness as willpower, as a cause? Are not all conscious phenomena only final phenomena, the lost links in a chain, but apparently conditioning one another in their sequence within the plane of consciousness? This might be an illusion. 667. Science does not inquire what impels us to will. On the contrary, it denies that willing takes place at all, and supposes that something quite different has happened. In short, that the belief in will and end is an illusion. It does not inquire into the motives of an action, as if these had been present in consciousness previous to the action, but it first divides the action up into a group of phenomena, and then seeks the previous history of this mechanical movement, but not in the terms of feeling, perception, and thought. From this quarter it can never accept the explanation. Perception is precisely the matter of science, which has to be explained. The problem of science is precisely to explain the world, without taking perceptions as the cause, for that would mean regarding perceptions themselves as the cause of perceptions. The task of science is by no means accomplished. Thus, either there is no such thing as will, the hypothesis of science, or the will is free. The latter assumption represents the prevailing feeling of which we cannot rid ourselves, even if the hypothesis of science were proved. The popular belief in cause and effect is founded on the principle that free will is the cause of every effect. Thereby alone do we arrive at the feeling of causation. And thereto belongs also to the feeling that every cause is not an effect, but always only a cause, if will is the cause. Our acts of will are not necessary. This lies in the very concept of will. The effect necessarily comes after the cause. That is what we feel. It is merely a hypothesis that even our willing is compulsory in every case. 668. To will is not to desire, to strive, to aspire to. It distinguishes itself from that through the passion of commanding. There is no such thing as willing, but only the willing of something. The aim must not be severed from the state, as the epistemologists sever it. Willing, as they understand it, is no more possible than thinking. It is a pure invention. It is essential to willing that something should be commanded, but that does not mean that the will is carried into effect. The general state of tension, by virtue of which a force seeks to discharge itself, is not willing. 669. Pain and pleasure are the most absurd means of expressing judgments, which of course does not mean that the judgments which are enunciated in this way must necessarily be absurd. The elimination of all substantiation and logic, a yes or no in the reduction to a passionate desire to have or to reject, an imperative abbreviation, the utility of which is irrefutable, that is pain and pleasure. Its origin is in the central sphere of the intellect. Its prerequisite is an infinitely accelerated process of perceiving, ordering, coordinating, calculating, concluding. Pleasure and pain are always final phenomena. They are never causes. As to deciding what provokes pain and pleasure, that is a question which depends upon the degree of power. The same thing, when confronted with a small quantity of power, may seem a danger and may suggest the need of speedy defense, and when confronted with the consciousness of greater power, may be a voluptuous stimulus and may be followed by a feeling of pleasure. All feelings of pleasure and pain presuppose a measuring of collective utility and collective harmfulness. Consequently, a sphere where there is willing of an object, of a condition, and the selection of the means thereto. Pleasure and pain are never original facts. The feelings of pleasure and pain are reactions of the will, emotions, in which the intellectual center fixes the value of certain supervening changes as a collective value, and also as an introduction of contrary actions. 670. The belief in emotions. Emotions are a fabrication of the intellect, an invention of causes which do not exist. All general bodily sensations which we do not understand are interpreted intellectually. That is to say, a reason is sought why we feel thus or thus among certain people or in certain experiences. Thus, something disadvantageous, dangerous, and strange is taken for granted, as if it were the cause of our being indisposed. As a matter of fact, it gets added to the indisposition so as to make our condition thinkable. Mighty rushes of blood to the brain accompanied by a feeling of suffocation are interpreted as anger. The people and things which provoke our anger are a means of relieving our physiological condition. Subsequently, after long habituation, certain processes and general feelings are so regularly correlated that the sight of certain processes provokes that condition of general feeling, and induces vascular engorgements, the ejection of seminal fluid, etc., when we say that the emotion is provoked by propinquity. Judgments already inhere in pleasure and pain. Stimuli become differentiated according as to whether they increase or reduce the feeling of power. The belief in willing. To believe that a thought may be cause of a mechanical movement is to believe in miracles. The consistency of science demands that once we have made the world thinkable for ourselves by means of pictures, we should also make the emotions, the desires, the will, etc., thinkable. That is to say, we should deny them and treat them as errors of the intellect. 671. Free will or no free will. There is no such thing as quote-unquote will. That is only a simplified conception on the part of the understanding, like matter. All actions must first be prepared and made possible mechanically before they can be willed. Or in most cases, the object of an action enters the brain only after everything is prepared for its accomplishment. The object is an inner stimulus, nothing more. 672. The most proximate prelude to an action relates to that action, but further back still there lies a preparatory history which covers a far wider field. The individual action is only a factor in a much more extensive and subsequent fact. The shorter and the longer processes are not reported. 673. The theory of chance. The soul is a selecting and self-nourishing being, which is persistently extremely clever and creative. This creative power is commonly overlooked. It is taken to be merely passive. I recognize the active and creative power within the accidental. Accident is in itself nothing more than the clashing of creative impulses. 674. Among the enormous multiplicity of phenomena to be observed in an organic being, that part which becomes conscious is a mere means, and the particle of virtue, self-abnegation, and other fanciful inventions are denied in a most thoroughgoing manner by the whole of the remaining phenomena. We would do well to study our organism in all its immorality. The animal functions are, as a matter of fact, 1,000,000 times more important than all beautiful states of the soul and heights of consciousness. The latter are an overflow, insofar as they are not needed as instruments in the service of the animal functions. The whole of conscious life, the spirit together with the soul, the heart, goodness, and virtue, in whose service does it work? In the greatest possible perfection of the means for acquiring nourishment and advancement, serving the fundamental animal functions above all, the ascent of the line of life. That which is called flesh and body is of such incalculably greater importance that the rest is nothing more than a small appurtenance. To continue the chain of life so that it becomes ever more powerful, that is the task. But now observe how the heart, the soul, virtue, and spirit together conspire formally to thwart this purpose, as if they were the object of every endeavor. The degeneration of life is essentially determined by the extraordinary fallibility of consciousness, which is held at bay least of all by the instincts, and thus commits the gravest and profoundest errors. Now, could any more insane extravagance of vanity be imagined than to measure the value of existence according to the pleasant or unpleasant feelings of this consciousness? It is obviously only a means, and pleasant or unpleasant feelings are also no more than means. According to what standard is the objective value measured? According to the quantity of increased and more organized power alone. 675. The value of all valuing. My desire would be to see the agent once more identified with the action, after action has been deprived of all meaning by having been separated in thought from the agent. I should like to see the notion of doing something, the idea of a purpose, of an intention, of an object, reintroduced into the action after action has been made insignificant by having been artificially separated from these things. All objects, purposes, meanings are only manners of expression and metamorphoses of the one will inherent in all phenomena, of the will to power. To have an object, a purpose, or an intention, in fact to will generally, is equivalent to the desire for greater strength, for fuller growth, and for the means thereto in addition. The most general and fundamental instinct in all action and willing is precisely on that account the one which is least known and is most concealed. For in practice we always follow its bidding, for the simple reason that we are in ourselves its bidding. All valuations are only the results of and the narrow points of view in serving this one will. Valuing in itself is nothing save this, will to power. To criticize existence from the standpoint of any one of these values is utter nonsense and error. Even supposing that a process of annihilation follows from such a value, even so this process is in the service of this will. The valuation of existence itself. But existence is this valuing itself, and even when we say no, we still do what we are. We ought now to perceive the absurdity of this pretense at judging existence, and we ought to try and discover what actually takes place there. It is symptomatic. 676. Concerning the origin of our valuations. We are able to analyze our body, and by doing so, we get the same idea of it as of the stellar system, and the differences between organic and inorganic lapses. Formerly, the movements of the stars were explained as the effects of beings consciously pursuing a purpose. This is no longer required, and even in regard to the movements of the body and its changes, the belief has long since been abandoned that they can be explained by an appeal to a consciousness which has a determined purpose. By far the greater number of movements have nothing to do with consciousness at all. Neither have they anything to do with sensation. Sensations and thoughts are extremely rare and insignificant things compared with the innumerable phenomena occurring every second. On the other hand, we believe that a certain conformity of means to ends rules over the very smallest phenomenon, which it is quite beyond our deepest science to understand, a sort of consciousness, selectiveness, coordination, and repairing process, etc. In short, we are in the presence of an activity to which it would be necessary to ascribe an incalculably higher and more extensive intellect than the one we are acquainted with. We learn to think less of all that is conscious. We unlearn the habit of making ourselves responsible for ourselves, because as conscious beings fixing purposes, we are but the smallest part of ourselves. Of the numerous influences taking effect every second, for instance, air, electricity, we feel scarcely anything at all. There might be a number of forces which, though they never make themselves felt by us, yet influence us continually. Pleasure and pain are very rare and scanty phenomena, compared with the countless stimuli with which a cell or an organ operates upon another cell or organ. It is the phase of the modesty of consciousness. Finally, we can grasp the conscious ego itself, merely as an instrument in the service of that higher and more extensive intellect. And then we may ask whether all conscious willing, all conscious purposes, all valuations are not perhaps only means by virtue of which something essentially different is attained from that which consciousness supposes. We mean, it is a question of our pleasure and pain, but pleasure and pain might be the means whereby we had something to do which lies outside our consciousness. This is to show how very superficial all conscious phenomena really are, how an action and the image of it differ, how little we know about what precedes an action, how fantastic our feelings, free will, and cause and effect are, how thoughts and images, just like words, are only signs of thoughts, the impossibility of finding the grounds of any action, the superficiality of all praise and blame, how essentially our conscious life is composed of fancies and illusion, how all our words merely stand for fancies, our emotions too, and how the union of mankind depends upon the transmission and continuation of these fancies, whereas at bottom the real union of mankind by means of procreation pursues its unknown way. Does this belief in the common fancies of men really alter mankind? Or is the whole body of ideas and valuations only an expression in itself of unknown changes? Are there really such things as will, purposes, thoughts, values? Is the whole of conscious life perhaps no more than mirage? Even when values seem to determine the actions of man, they are, as a matter of fact, doing something quite different. In short, granting that a certain conformity of means to ends might be demonstrated in the action of nature, without the assumption of a ruling ego, could not our notion of purposes and our will, etc., be only a symbolic language standing for something quite different? That is to say, something not willing and unconscious, only the thinnest semblance of that natural conformity of means to an end in the organic world, but not in any way different therefrom? Briefly, perhaps the whole of mental development is a matter of the body. It is the consciously recorded history of the fact that a higher body is forming. The organic ascends to higher regions. Our longing to know nature is a means by virtue of which the body would reach perfection. Or, better still, hundreds of thousands of experiments are made to alter the nourishment and the mode of living of the body. The body's consciousness and valuations, its kind of pleasure and pain, are signs of these changes and experiments. In the end, it is not a question concerning man, for he must be surpassed. 677. To what extent are all interpretations of the world symptoms of a ruling instinct? The artistic contemplation of the world, to sit before the world and to survey it. But here the analysis of aesthetical contemplation, its reduction to cruelty, its feeling of security, its judicial and detached attitude, etc., are lacking. The artist himself must be taken together with his psychology, the criticism of the instinct of play as a discharge of energy, the love of change, the love of bringing one's soul in touch with strange things, the absolute egoism of the artist, etc. What instincts does he sublimate? The scientific contemplation of the world, a criticism of the psychological longing for science, the desire to make everything comprehensible, the desire to make everything practical, useful, capable of being exploited. To what extent this is anti-aesthetic? Only that value counts which may be reckoned in figures. How it happens that a mediocre type of man preponderates under the influence of science. It would be terrible if even history were to be taken possession of in this way. The realm of the superior, of the judicial, what instincts are here sublimated? The religious contemplation of the world, a criticism of the religious man. It is not necessary to take the moral man as the type, but the man who has extreme feelings of exaltation and of deep depression, and who interprets the former with thankfulness or suspicion without, however, seeking their origin in himself, nor the latter either. The man who essentially feels anything but free, who sublimates his conditions in states of submission. The moral contemplation of the world. The feelings peculiar to certain social ranks are projected into the universe. Stability, law, the making of things orderly, and the making of things alike are sought in the highest spheres, because they are valued most highly, above everything or behind everything. What is common to all? The ruling instincts wish to be regarded as the highest values in general, even as the creative and ruling powers. It is understood that these instincts either oppose or overcome each other, join up synthetically or alternate in power. Their profound antagonism is, however, so great that in those cases in which they all insist upon being gratified, a man of very thorough mediocrity is the outcome. 678. It is a question whether the origin of our apparent knowledge is not also a mere offshoot of our older valuations, which are so completely assimilated that they belong to the very basis of our nature. In this way only the more recent needs engage in battle with results of the oldest needs. The world is seen, felt, and interpreted thus and thus, in order that organic life may be preserved with this particular manner of interpretation. Man is not only an individual, but the continuation of collective organic life in one definite line. The fact that man survives proves that a certain species of interpretations, even though it still be added to, has also survived. That as a system, this method of interpreting has not changed. Adaption. Our dissatisfaction, our ideal, etc., may possibly be the result of this incorporated piece of interpretation, of our particular point of view. The organic world may ultimately perish owing to it, just as the division of labor in organisms may be the means of bringing about the ruin of the whole, if one part happen to wither or weaken. The destruction of organic life, and even of the highest form thereof, must follow the same principles as the destruction of the individual. 679. Judged from the standpoint of the theory of descent, individuation shows the continuous breaking up of one into two, and the equally continuous annihilation of individuals for the sake of a few individuals, which evolution bears onwards. The greater mass always perishes. The body. The fundamental phenomena. Innumerable individuals are sacrificed for the sake of a few, in order to make the few possible. One must not allow oneself to be deceived. The case is the same with peoples and races. They produce the body for the generation of isolated, invaluable individuals, who continue the great process. 680. I am opposed to the theory that the individual studies the interest of the species, or of posterity, at the cost of his own advantage. All this is only apparent. The excessive importance which he attaches to the sexual instinct is not the result of the latter's importance to the species, for procreation is the actual performance of the individual. It is his greatest interest, and therefore it is his highest expression of power, not judged from the standpoint of consciousness, but from the very center of the individual. 681. The fundamental errors of the biologists who have lived hitherto, it is not a matter of the species, but of rearing stronger individuals. The many are only a means. Life is not the continuous adjustment of internal relations to external relations, but will to power, which, proceeding from inside, subjugates and incorporates an ever-increasing quantity of external phenomena. These biologists continue the moral valuations, the absolutely higher worth of altruism, the antagonism towards the lust of dominion, towards war, towards all that which is not useful, and towards all order of rank and of class. 682. In natural science, the moral depreciation of the ego still goes hand in hand with the overestimation of the species. But the species is quite as illusory as the ego. A false distinction has been made. The ego is 100 times more than a mere unit in a chain of creatures. It is the chain itself, in every possible respect, and the species is merely an abstraction suggested by the multiplicity and partial similarity of these chains. That the individual is sacrificed to the species, as people often say he is not a fact at all. It is rather only an example of false interpretation. 683. The formula of the progress superstition, according to a famous physiologist of the cerebral regions. Quote, animals never progress as a species. Only man progresses as a species. End quote. No. 684. Anti-Darwin. The domestication of man. What definite value can it have, or has domestication in itself a definite value? There are reasons for denying the latter proposition. Darwin's school of thought certainly goes to great pains to convince us of the reverse. It would fain prove that the influence of domestication may be profound and fundamental. For the time being, we stand firmly as we did before. Up to the present, no results of very superficial modification or degeneration have been shown to follow upon domestication, and everything that escapes from the hand and discipline of man returns almost immediately to its original natural condition. The type remains constant. Man cannot denature la nature. Biologists reckon upon the struggle for existence, the death of the weaker creature, and the survival of the most robust, most gifted combatant. On that account they imagine a continuous increase in the perfection of all creatures. We, on the contrary, have convinced ourselves of the fact that in the struggle for existence, accident serves the cause of the weak quite as much as that of the strong, that craftiness often supplements strength with advantage, that the prolificness of a species is related in a remarkable manner to that species' chances of destruction. Natural selection is also credited with the power of slowly effecting unlimited metamorphoses. It is believed that every advantage is transmitted by heredity and strengthened in the course of generations, when heredity is known to be so capricious that happy adaptations of certain creatures to very special conditions of life are regarded as the result of surrounding influences. Nowhere, however, are examples of unconscious selection to be found, absolutely nowhere. The most different individuals associate with one another. The extremes become lost in the mass. Each vies with the other to maintain his kind. Those creatures whose appearance shields them from certain dangers do not alter this appearance when they are in an environment quite devoid of danger. If they live in places where their coats or their hides do not conceal them, they do not adapt themselves to their surroundings in any way. The selection of the most beautiful has been so exaggerated that it greatly exceeds the instincts for beauty in our own race. As a matter of fact, the most beautiful creature often couples with the most debased, and the largest with the smallest. We almost always see males and females taking advantage of their first chance meeting and manifesting no taste or selectiveness at all. Modification through climate and nourishment, but as a matter of fact unimportant. There are no intermediate forms. The growing evolution of creatures is assumed. All grounds for this assumption are entirely lacking. Every type has its limitations. Beyond these, evolution cannot carry it. My general point of view. First proposition. Man as a species is not progressing. Higher specimens are indeed attained, but they do not survive. The general level of the species is not raised. Second proposition. Man as a species does not represent any sort of progress compared with any other animal. The whole of the animal and plant world does not develop from the lower to the higher, but all simultaneously, haphazardly, confusedly, and at variance. The richest and most complex forms, and the term higher type means no more than this, perish more easily. Only the lowest succeed in maintaining their apparent imperishableness. The former are seldom attained and maintain their superior position with difficulty. The latter are compensated by great fruitfulness. In the human race also, the superior specimens, the happy cases of evolution, are the first to perish amid the fluctuations of chances for and against them. They are exposed to every form of decadence. They are extreme, and on that account alone already decadents. The short duration of beauty, of genius, of the Caesar is sui generis. Such things are not hereditary. The type is inherited. There is nothing extreme or particularly happy about a type. It is not a case of a particular fate or of the evil will of nature, but merely of the concept superior type. The higher type is an example of an incomparably greater degree of complexity, a greater sum of coordinated elements. But on this account, disintegration becomes 1,000 times more threatening. Genius is the sublimest machine in existence, hence it is the most fragile. Third proposition. The domestication, culture of man does not sink very deep. When it does sink far below the skin, it immediately becomes degeneration. Type, the Christian. The wild man, or in moral terminology, the evil man, is a reversion to nature, and in a certain sense, he represents a recovery, a cure from the effects of culture. 685. Anti-Darwin. What surprises me most on the making a general survey of the great destinies of man is that I invariably see the reverse of what today Darwin in his school sees or will persist in seeing: selection in favor of the stronger, the better constituted, and the progress of the species. Precisely the reverse of this stares one in the face: the suppression of the lucky cases, the uselessness of the more highly constituted types, the inevitable mastery of the mediocre, and even of those who are below mediocrity. Unless we are shown some reason why man is an exception among living creatures, I incline to the belief that Darwin's school is everywhere at fault. That will to power, in which I perceive the ultimate reason and character of all change, explains why it is that lucky selection is never in favor of the exceptions and of the lucky cases. The strongest and happiest natures are weak when they are confronted with a majority ruled by organized gregarious instincts and the fear which possesses the weak. My general view of the world of values shows that in the highest values which now sway the destiny of man, the happy cases among men, the select specimens, do not prevail, but rather the decadent specimens. Perhaps there is nothing more interesting in the world than this unpleasant spectacle. Strange as it may seem, the strong always have to be upheld against the weak, and the well-constituted against the ill-constituted, the healthy against the sick and physiologically botched. If we drew our morals from reality, they would read thus: the mediocre are more valuable than the exceptional creatures, and the decadent than the mediocre. The will to non-entity prevails over the will to life, and the general aim now is, in Christian, Buddhistic, Schopenhauerian phraseology, quote, "It is better not to be than to be," end quote. I protest against this formulating of reality into a moral, and I loathe Christianity with a deadly loathing, because it created sublime words and attitudes in order to deck a revolting truth with all the tawdriness of justice, virtue, and godliness. I see all philosophers and the whole of science on their knees before a reality which is the reverse of the struggle for life, as Darwin and his school understood it. That is to say, wherever I look, I see those prevailing and surviving who throw doubt and suspicion upon life and the value of life. The error of the Darwinian school becomes a problem to me. How can one be so blind as to make this mistake? That species show an ascending tendency is the most nonsensical assertion that has ever been made. Until now, they have only manifested a dead level. There is nothing whatever to prove that the higher organisms have developed from the lower. I see that the lower, owing to their numerical strength, their craft and ruse now preponderate, and I fail to see an instance in which an accidental change produces an advantage, at least not for a very long period, for it would be necessary to find some reason why an accidental change should become so very strong. I do indeed find that cruelty of nature, which is so often referred to, but in a different place. Nature is cruel, but against her lucky and well-constituted children, she protects and shelters and loves the lowly. In short, the increase of a species' power as the result of the preponderance of its particularly well-constituted and strong specimens is perhaps less of a certainty than it is the result of the preponderance of its mediocre and lower specimens. In the case of the latter, we find great fruitfulness and permanence. In the case of the former, the besetting dangers are greater. Waste is more rapid, and decimation more speedy. 686. Man, as he has appeared up to the present, is the embryo of the man of the future. All the formative powers which are to produce the latter already lie in the former, and owing to the fact that they are enormous, the more promising for the future the modern individual happens to be, the more suffering falls to his lot. This is the profoundest concept of suffering. The formative powers clash. The isolation of the individual need not deceive one. As a matter of fact, some uninterrupted current does actually flow through all individuals, and does thus unite them. The fact that they feel themselves isolated is the most powerful spur in the process of setting themselves the loftiest aims. Their search for happiness is the means which keeps together and moderates the formative powers, and keeps them from being mutually destructive. 687. Excessive intellectual strength sets itself new goals. It is not in the least satisfied by the command and the leadership of the inferior world, or by the preservation of the organism of the quote-unquote individual. We are more than the individual. We are the whole chain itself, with the tasks of all possible futures of that chain in us. This is the end of Part 5 of Book 3 of The Will to Power by Friedrich Nietzsche. Thank you for listening.